When I was 16, I was diagnosed as having anxiety and depression. I had been homeless for a couple of years. I was in the process of overcoming the abuse I faced in my home as when I was younger. I had no living skills. I found it difficult to talk to people, to go to the grocery store, even to be outside. I was in different emergency housing atmospheres, so I did have a place to stay at times. When I did, I mostly stayed indoors. I would come out when it was dark and no one could see me. I had difficulty sleeping. I would go for days without sleep. I would get so depressed, I would just stay in bed sometimes for weeks. So in order to get housing or food benefits, I would have to go for an evaluation at a local agency. And I went through this process numerous times. Each time I was given a different list of diagnoses. Every person had a different opinion. Everybody. I've been everything from manic depressive to having a personality disorder. I'm diagnosed with at least 4 different types of depressive illnesses. I lived in emergency housing on and off from the age of 16 to approximately the age of 22 or 23. And it was on and off. It was very difficult to not only to obtain those services, but to keep them. I would often find that my housing was taken away for reasons that were unknown to me. There would be an appointment I didn't attend but had never been made aware of. And at those times, I would sleep outdoors, in baseball dugouts, people's garages, vehicles. I fell into a period of severe substance abuse. It's difficult for me to recall. It actually began when I was about 19. It's hard to remember really what I did throughout that phase of my life. I know that when I was really hungry and really tired and cold, things like that, really uncomfortable, I would go to the emergency room and force them to admit me to the psychiatric unit through things such as cutting in front of them, self-mutilation in their presence. So it's their policy to admit you in those instances. So I would stay there in the hospital for brief periods of time. Because of our substance abuse, it forced us into a habit of constantly seeking money to support our habit, and we would often find enough money to cover our own housing. When I was 19, I married someone who at the time was my friend. We were both addicts with mental health issues, and it seemed like a good fit. Once we were married, Bill and I began a course of pure insanity. It was a downhill slide. We abused drugs and alcohol, and we suffered constant instability. It was a very tumultuous period. I became pregnant when I was 20 years old. I remained clean through a portion of my pregnancy, but eventually I relapsed. It was very difficult. We were in the midst of such chaos. There were people abusing drugs all around us. it was difficult to stay clean in that atmosphere. The the substance abuse itself lends a separate set of issues. People who are around might have mental health issues themselves or be engaged in criminal activity. So I pretty much lived in an environment where I never knew what was going to happen. People would steal things, people would fight, people would get sick in front of me. I watched somebody die at one point, and in the midst of it, here I was pregnant and just seeing, feeling out of control, seeing the world around me out of control, wanting to change that and just not knowing how. During my pregnancy, I had wanted to get clean and get help. I was told by people I knew who had had experience with drug addiction, parenting, pregnancy, that I would lose my child if I sought help. So I pretty much stayed hidden. I gave birth to my daughter December 29th of 2005. In the hospital, she tested negative for drugs, and I thought we were okay. A few days later, I found out in extended testing my daughter had showed traces of drugs, and I was simply chastised and told to abstain from those behaviors. When Giselle, my daughter, was 3 months old, or just about, Children's Services was called. They came to my house and informed me that someone had made claims that there were drugs in the home, drug use. They asked me to go for a drug test, and approximately 5 days later, Children's Services came to my home with police officers to inform me that we had failed the drug screening and that they would like me to give my daughter into their custody. The social worker told me that she would like me to sign my daughter into foster care, and if I did, the judge would look favorably upon me. He would like that I was trying very hard to work with them and be transparent in my actions and allow them into the home. It's always hard for me to talk about giving her away because I carried her down the stairs, and they had a van downstairs, and they asked me to place her into the car seat, and I did. I buckled her into the car seat and I kissed her, and I didn't see her for at least another week. She was just gone. Approximately 4 days later, they asked me to come down to their offices to see my daughter. We came down, my husband and myself, to see her, and she wasn't there. I asked them where she was, and they told me they couldn't divulge that information and that we were there to sign paperwork. I asked them when we would be able to see my daughter. They didn't know, and I had to be very persistent and really question them repeatedly before they informed me we could have some type of court hearing. There was a court hearing that ordered visitation, and we were then allowed to see her for half an hour in a small room upstairs in the Department of Social Services with a caseworker supervising us. and no one ever told me what was going on. We did go to court. I had a college fund at the time. I used it to hire an attorney. When we got into the courtroom, she told me to plead guilty to everything. There was a list. There was this thick piece of paper that had a number of accusations on it. Some of them were true, some of them were not. I pointed that out to her, and she informed me that the judge would get really angry if I started picking it apart and trying to claim I didn't do certain elements, that it would be easier to just agree, just say I did it, and then show that I'm working with them. I thought that she was experienced enough and knew how to work these types of cases. I also figured she must know more than me. I'm not a lawyer. So I did. I agreed to everything. I said I did things horrible things that I wouldn't do. I'm not perfect. I'm not. And I do regret some of my choices from the past, but there is no way I could bring myself to do some of the things that were listed in that petition. Once we did that, I was placed in jail and charged with child neglect and abuse. I had no end date to my jail sentence. I was just there until the judge wanted to let me out. I was told they were getting me into treatment, but 4 months later, I still didn't have a bed in treatment anywhere, and had the woman who comes into the jail to coordinate drug treatment programs had not spoken to me. I was entered into the family court drug court program. When I finished my application in that program, they informed me that successful completion would make some of my charges go, or all of my charges go away, and my daughter would come home. So I did it. At 4.5 months, I was called back to drug court again. I had been going on a weekly basis, but I was called out, and they informed me they were sending me home, that they could not find a bed in a rehab for me, that they had at one point had one partially arranged, but somebody had messed up the paperwork, and so I could go home, and that they would like me to go to a halfway house at some point. I received my bed in a halfway house for persons with mental illness, and then spent my days in treatment, theoretically. Treatment at that point required me to meet the requirements of drug court, social services, the family court in itself outside of drug court, and the halfway house. Each program had their requirements. So I would sit in a day treatment program from approximately 8 o'clock in the morning until 3:30, then go to substance abuse treatment until 5:30. Then I would go to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting anywhere from, they lasted until 9 o'clock on most nights, 7:30 on some. And then I would have to find a way back to the halfway house, and I'd go to bed and start all over the next day. At times I was allowed visitation with my daughter. Visits were scheduled for 1 hour twice a week. I would see my daughter in a room upstairs from the Department of Social Services. Drug court at the time would sanction me with jail sentences of 1 to 2 weeks if I was late for an appointment, if social services scheduled 2 appointments for the same time slot and I chose the wrong one to go to. There were so many reasons why I could be incarcerated, and I did in fact spend most of a year incarcerated. My daughter at one point was ordered to be brought to me at the jail for visitation, and it was very difficult. She was an infant, and I was not allowed to hold her. I could not kiss her. I was allowed one brief hug, and the social worker would have to hold her up in the air over a concrete wall for me to just barely see. For the better part of 2 years, this was our pattern. Every step of the way, I begged for more time with my child. I begged for my legal right, which was to have my visitation progress. After 2 years, there's no reason why a person who is following all the recommendations set forth, there's no reason why you shouldn't have unsupervised visitation, which I was never allowed. I stayed clean for over a year. I relapsed twice in a period of approximately 3 years. One of those relapses was 3 days, and the other lasted a couple of weeks. At which point I decided to go into a rehab program, which I attended and completed after 54 days. It was a residential program. Due to the fact that I was located 2 hours away in the rehab, my daughter was brought to me twice the first month and once the second month. They did not seem affected by my presence in rehab. At that point, I don't think it mattered. They had already decided that my daughter should stay with her foster parents. I had always fought for my daughter, but while I was in rehab, I came to the conclusion that that might be somewhat selfish of me. Visits were difficult. My daughter would always take so much time to adjust, and when I would have to put her back in their vehicle to go back to her foster parents, she would cry a lot. She would be very upset that I was leaving her again, and I tried to see it from her perspective, the fact that she was being abandoned by me again and again. And I realized I couldn't keep doing that to her just to fight a losing battle. It wasn't fair. She needed stability. She needed to be okay. And I decided to surrender my custody of her. My daughter had initially been placed with a family who was looking to adopt a child permanently, and I did confirm with social services that my daughter would be legally adopted by that family if I surrendered my rights to her. That was important to me. I didn't want her shuffled around within the foster care system. I surrendered all parental rights